The date of August 10th, 2024, is now seared into the collective memory of a once quiet community, a day that transitioned from a desperate search into a scene of unspeakable horror. It was on this sweltering summer afternoon that a team of investigators, methodically combing through a designated grid search area, unearthed a sight that would irrevocably shatter the innocence of a neighborhood and freeze the blood of even the most seasoned law enforcement professionals. There, concealed beneath a shallow layer of recently disturbed earth, was a small, heartbreaking shape, meticulously wrapped in a familiar child's bedspread, a pattern of cartoon race cars that several officers instantly recognized from the missing person flyers that had papered the town for weeks. The scene descended into a profound, heavy silence, broken only by the static crackle of police radios. Seasoned detectives, individuals who had witnessed the full spectrum of human cruelty, found themselves momentarily paralyzed, their faces etched with a unique blend of professional resolve and very personal anguish. They understood, in that grim moment, that this discovery was fundamentally different. It was a violation of the most sacred trust, a crime that struck at the very heart of family and childhood itself. Just a few yards away, this devastating discovery was met with a chilling counterpoint. A 17-year-old boy, Damien Moore, was being escorted into the rear of a patrol car. His wrists secured in handcuffs. His head was bowed so low his chin nearly touched his chest, a posture of abject defeat or perhaps profound shame, refusing to meet the lenses of the news cameras that had swarmed the periphery, or the disbelieving eyes of the crowd gathering behind the police tape. The air was thick with a cacophony of whispered questions, all variations on a single, paralyzing theme. Why? How could a teenager, on the cusp of adulthood, harbor a secret of such monstrous darkness? What sinister alchemy had occurred within the walls of that seemingly ordinary home to transmute familial love into something so twisted and unrecognizable, while the brutal, factual crime would be enough to shock the conscience of the entire nation? The intricate and deeply unsettling story behind it, the slow, insidious erosion of a young mind, would prove infinitely more difficult to comprehend. This was not a story of a sudden, explosive act of violence by a stranger, but a meticulously constructed tragedy built over years upon a foundation of jealousy, simmering resentment, and a desperate, starved need for attention. These were not fleeting emotions but threads that had been carefully, if unconsciously, stitched into the very fabric of the Moore family's daily life for over a decade. And yet, tragically, no one standing on the outside, and perhaps even those on the inside, recognized how perilously close the entire structure was to catastrophic failure. The warning signs had been present, visible like faint cracks in a dam, for anyone who knew how to look. But they were missed, dismissed, or rationalized away until it was far too late. So, what powerful, dark forces could drive a young man to turn with such violence against his own innocent brother? This is a journey into the darkest corners of familial dysfunction, a case study in neglected cries for help, and an examination of how a child can become a killer. Now it's your turn, fam. What's your verdict? Drop a comment and let me know your name and where you're watching from, whether that's Chicago, Illinois, or London, England. Welcome to a special, in-depth edition of The Killer Next Door. We thank you for your continued support as we dare to dive into the world's most complex and heartbreaking crime stories. If you want to explore more stories that force us to confront the darkest corners of the human psyche, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay aware. The public story began on the morning of June 29, 2024, when 6-year-old Caleb Moore was first reported missing. The news spread with viral urgency, transforming a personal family crisis into a communal nightmare, the kind every parent fears in their most secret, anxious thoughts. The image of Caleb's smiling, gap-toothed face, a boy described as a sunbeam in human form, was suddenly everywhere, on television news broadcasts, shared across social media feeds, and plastered on lampposts and store windows. Vigils were organized, search parties assembled, and an entire town held its breath, praying for a safe return. But to truly understand the cataclysm that befell the Moore household, one must first endeavor to know the individuals within it and the dynamics that governed their lives. The tragedy did not spontaneously generate on that summer night. It was the poisonous harvest of seeds planted many years prior. Everything, as is so often the case in familial crimes, begins at home. The Moore family presented, to the outside world, a picture of working-class resilience. Yet, beneath that veneer of normalcy, each member played a role in a delicate and increasingly unstable ecosystem. Regina Moore, at 41, was the weary heart of the home. A nursing aide by profession, she was a woman who carried a profound, bone-deep exhaustion like a second shadow, yet she never ceased her relentless forward motion. Colleagues and patients described her as the embodiment of selflessness, the kind of caregiver who ensured her charges were comforted and fed, even if it meant skipping her own meals. She would offer a warm, tired smile when elderly patients murmured, "God bless you," a blessing she seemingly never had the time to bestow upon herself. Her love for her sons was the central axis of her existence, but the unyielding pressures of life, financial instability, grueling work hours, marital distance, wore her down like water on stone. She was a deeply caring mother, perpetually patching holes in their life with sheer willpower and fatigue, but the cracks in her family's foundation were widening faster than she could repair them. Terence Moore, 45, was the often absent pillar of the home. A mechanic who worked long, physically demanding shifts, his philosophy of parenting was rooted in a stern, traditional belief that discipline was the highest form of love. However, his physical and emotional absence created a void in the household far more profound than any presence his stern words could fill. He was a man of few words, emotionally distant, expressing paternal affection through brief, approving nods or the occasional, awkward pat on the back, a language of love his sensitive eldest son never learned to decipher. This emotional chasm left an indelible mark on Damien, creating a hunger for validation that would never be satiated. Then there was Damien Moore, 17 years old. To his teachers, he was an enigma, intellectually bright but emotionally inaccessible, a teenager who seemed to inhabit a private, internal world, moving through the hallways of his school and the rooms of his home with a quiet, unsettling edge that worried some and simply annoyed others. He was profoundly withdrawn and unpredictably moody, the kind of boy who appeared to carry a perpetual, brewing storm in his chest, a tempest invisible to the outside world. Family members who gathered for holidays and birthdays began to notice a specific, chilling flicker of resentment in his eyes, a darkness that would surface whenever his younger brother laughed too freely or soaked up a disproportionate share of their mother's dwindling energy. And finally, there was Caleb Moore, 6 years old, the radiant center of his mother's universe. He was a child brimming with an infectious, joyful vitality, the kind of boy who could enter a room and inexplicably make it feel brighter. Adored by his teachers and classmates, he was known for his generous spirit, often giving his friends the last piece of candy from his pocket. His innocence and innate kindness made people feel that he possessed an old soul, a heart far wiser than his 6 years would suggest. He loved his mother with a fierce, uncomplicated devotion, always clinging to her medical scrubs when she returned home late from work, his small face lighting up the moment she walked through the door. He was, without question, the beacon of light that guided Regina through her exhaustion and the glue that held her world together. On the surface, the Moores were a family like countless others, parents working tirelessly to provide, a teenager navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence, and a young child who still viewed the world through a lens of wonder and safety. But for those who knew to look closer, the tension was a palpable, thrumming presence just beneath the thin surface of their daily lives. It simmered in the strained silences at the dinner table, in the way Terence's criticism landed on Damien, and in the way Regina's overtaxed attention naturally flowed toward her less complicated, more openly affectionate younger son. When the devastating truth was finally forced into the open on that August day, it became horrifyingly clear that the warning signs had been there all along, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to an abyss. But no one, not even those closest to him, truly believed that Damien Moore was capable of crossing that final, unthinkable line. This now forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. If you were in Regina's worn-out shoes, would you have noticed the subtle shifts in your son's behavior? Would you have looked at Damien's sullenness and isolation with a more critical, concerned eye, or would you, in the midst of survival-mode parenting, have brushed it off as just another difficult teenage phase? We encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below, because the tragic truth of this case, and so many others like it, is that the smallest details we ignore, the quietest cries for help we dismiss, can sometimes metastasize into the biggest mistakes we never get a chance to undo. The story of what culminated in the summer of 2024 did not begin on the night of June 28. Its origins can be traced back over a decade, to a period around 2010, when the marriage of Regina and Terence Moore was already fighting private, unspoken battles. They had moved into their modest home with the hopeful intention of a fresh start, but the relentless weight of financial pressure and mounting frustrations followed them through the front door, an unwelcome guest in every room. Regina fought a daily war to hold the fragile family unit together, working double shifts and attempting to mend their emotional and financial holes with sheer determination. Terence, meanwhile, carried his own burdens, spending long hours in a greasy garage, believing his role was solely that of a provider. Yet, instead of easing the familial strain, his emotional distance only grew, creating a vacuum where a father's guidance should have been. There was likely love in that house once, but as the years accumulated, what remained was largely a hollow routine, a series of motions performed by exhausted individuals simply to get through the day. And the children growing up in the center of this emotional drought absorbed far more than any adult realized. In the years preceding Caleb's birth, Damien was the sole focus of his parents' world, for better and for worse. To his mother, he was her firstborn, the boy who needed her comfort after her interminably long shifts. To his father, he was a living mirror of every unmet expectation and unachieved standard of masculinity. Terence possessed a knack for setting the bar impossibly high, delivering critiques disguised as motivation. "Stand tall, stop acting weak, be more like the other boys." These phrases were not isolated comments, they became a relentless, damaging rhythm that underscored Damien's childhood, a constant comparison that systematically carved away at his fragile sense of self-worth. For a sensitive child, repeatedly hearing that he is not enough does not simply fade with time, it digs in, takes root, and poisons his worldview. By 2013, when Damien was in elementary school, trained educators were already observing concerning patterns. He wasn't the typically disruptive child, he wasn't a class clown or an overt bully. Instead, he existed on the social periphery, hovering at the edges of the playground, a silent observer who rarely engaged in collaborative play. While other children paired up for projects and games, Damien remained isolated. His artistic expressions were particularly telling. Where his peers drew cheerful scenes of houses under smiling suns and happy families, Damien's sketches often depicted stark walls, closed doors, and solitary figures standing at great distances from one another. One particularly perceptive teacher later admitted that she had written a private note in his file. "This child draws loneliness." It was never a sentence meant for his parents to read, but in the devastating hindsight of the investigation, it read like a prophetic, early warning signal from a crying soul. The birth of Caleb in 2018 acted as a seismic event in the family's dynamic, and the shift in Damien's world was immediate and visible to those who were looking. Regina's younger sister, Lydia, then 38, had begun spending more time at the house to help with the new baby. Lydia possessed a sharp, intuitive sense for people, and she noticed a chilling change in her nephew during that chaotic time. While the entire family gathered around to coo over the newborn, a 14-year-old Damien remained planted at the edge of the room, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his jaw visibly clenched. Lydia, attempting to diffuse the tension, tried to coax him closer, teasing that he was now the big brother, the protector. He shot her a look of pure venom and muttered under his breath, "He gets everything." For a boy on the precarious edge of adolescence, those 3 words carried a weight far beyond typical sibling jealousy. Lydia took her sister aside that very night and delivered a clear warning. "Don't you ignore that. He's telling you exactly how he feels." But Regina, utterly buried in the exhaustion of newborn care and financial survival, rationalized it away. She told herself it was a normal, transient jealousy that all older siblings experience. The tragic reality, as time would prove, was that it was not normal. It was a germinating seed of profound resentment, and it was growing exponentially with each passing day. In the years following Caleb's arrival, the signs became more pronounced. By 2019, Damien's temper began to flare in school settings, particularly during group activities when things didn't proceed according to his ideas. He would sometimes storm out of classrooms without permission. Teachers overheard him muttering angrily under his breath, furious that nobody ever listens to me. At home, the snapping intensified. If Regina dared to praise Caleb for some small accomplishment, a crayon drawing, a good grade on a spelling test, Damien would react by slamming his bedroom door with enough force to rattle the walls. One teacher had a distinct memory of watching Damien on the playground, staring blankly at other children playing, and clearly uttering to himself, "He always wins. He always gets what he wants." Terrence's behavior, unfortunately, only served to pour gasoline on the fire. With Caleb, the stern father seemed to soften, displaying a gentleness and openness he had never afforded Damien. He would carry the toddler on his shoulders, laugh freely at his antics, and let down his emotional walls for the younger boy, walls that Damien had spent his entire life crashing against. For Damien, this stark contrast was a psychological blade that twisted constantly. While Caleb received hugs and laughter, he received commands to man up. While Caleb was openly praised, he was reminded of his shortcomings. It mattered little if Terrence believed he was motivating his eldest. What Damien internalized was a brutal, simple equation. His father's love had been given away, transferred wholesale to his younger brother. By 2020, Damien was solidly in his mid-teens, and his isolation had hardened from a phase into a deeply ingrained habit. He spent hours locked in his room, headphones blaring music to drown out the sounds of the family he felt alienated from, often leaving dinner plates untouched outside his door. At school, his reputation solidified, bright, but moody and unpredictable, quick to anger, yet utterly silent when asked to articulate what was wrong. His few friends gradually drifted away, citing his volatility and inability to connect. Lydia continued to sound the alarm to her sister. "This boy feels completely pushed aside," she insisted. "If you don't deal with this, Regina, it's going to explode." Regina would nod, overwhelmed, but she never found the time, energy, or resources to confront the gathering storm. How does one confront a hurricane when they are already drowning in the day-to-day struggle to keep a roof overhead and food on the table? The warning signs continued to stack, higher and more perilous. With each passing year, a critical moment arrived in 2021. A concerned English teacher pulled Regina aside after school. Damien had submitted an essay for a personal narrative assignment. It wasn't a dramatic cry for help filled with angry prose. Rather, it was a flat, emotionless statement about wanting to become invisible, about how no one at home ever truly noticed him unless he did something wrong. Regina took the paper, read its bleak contents, tucked it into her purse, and told herself it was merely standard teenage angst and melodrama. But professionals in child psychology will affirm that teenagers often speak the most profound truths in the plainest of words. We, as adults, simply refuse to believe them until it is too late. By 2022, Damien's resentment was no longer whispered or confined to private journals. It began to spill out in open arguments with his mother. He would accuse her directly of favoritism. "You only care about him," he screamed at her on one occasion after violently slamming a kitchen cabinet shut. Regina would try to reassure him of her equal love, but her words seemed to bounce off the high, impenetrable walls he had built inside his mind. School faculty continued to note his behavior, observing how he would clench his fists during recess, muttering darkly about being replaced and forgotten. To an outsider, these might seem like small, isolated moments of teenage discontent. But when pieced together, they formed a terrifying mosaic of a boy drowning in a sea of jealousy and burning anger. And then came the moment that would haunt Regina Moore for the rest of her life. It was in the late fall of 2023. She was folding laundry in the living room, stacking Caleb's small, brightly colored t-shirts into a neat pile. Damien appeared in the doorway and stood there silently for an uncomfortably long time. When she finally looked up and met his gaze, his expression was chillingly unreadable, but his voice was not. It was low, sharp, and terrifyingly steady. "Don't you ever have another one? If you do, it'll just be me left." He didn't laugh. He didn't smile. He didn't offer any indication that it was a joke made in poor taste. He simply delivered the statement, turned on his heel, and walked away. Regina stood frozen, the small shirt still clutched in her hand. In that moment, she made a conscious choice. She told herself it was just a cruel, throwaway remark from a bitter and emotionally stunted teenager. She never repeated it to Terence. She never shared it with Lydia. She never informed the school counselors who had already raised flags. She filed it away in a deep chamber of denial, hoping that by ignoring it, its ominous power would simply vanish. But words of that nature do not vanish. They fester. They sit in the silence, waiting for the moment to remind you of what you chose to miss. This is the part of the story that lingers most hauntingly. Because those words were not a simple burst of adolescent anger. They were a clear, unequivocal warning, plain as day, that the love he might have once felt had curdled into something far darker and more dangerous. It was the kind of warning that, if it had been taken seriously and met with immediate, intensive intervention, might have altered the course of history. But it wasn't. This begs a question of our audience. Parents, guardians, have you ever heard words from your child that stopped you in your tracks? Perhaps a statement that left you chilled, something you weren't sure was a genuine threat or merely a venting of frustration. Did you, in your exhaustion or disbelief, push it aside, or did you act upon it? Please share your experiences in the comments, because what you may be dismissing today could very well be the very thing you cannot take back tomorrow. Looking back across those formative years, from 2010 to 2023, the pieces of the puzzle were all there, scattered across the timeline, the relentless financial struggles that strained a marriage to its breaking point, the constant, damaging comparisons that scarred a young boy's developing psyche, the disproportionate attention poured onto one child while the other was forced to watch from the deepening shadows, the teachers and educators who documented the signs of profound distress, the concerned aunt who repeatedly spoke up, the mother who heard the most direct warning imaginable but chose, out of fear or exhaustion, to bury it. Each individual piece might not have told the whole story on its own. But when assembled, they constructed the precise path that led straight into an unthinkable tragedy. As 2023 drew to a close, that path was nearly complete. Damien was no longer just a resentful teenager, he had vocalized his darkest intention. A psychological line had been drawn in the sand. The only question that remained was how long it would take for him to decide to cross it. The atmosphere within the Moore household in the final week of June 2024 was charged with a tension that, in retrospect, was a screaming siren. On June 25th, something palpable shifted during the family's evening meal. Regina would later recall to investigators how Damien had barely touched his food, his fork hovering over his plate, while his eyes remained fixed on Caleb with an unnerving intensity. 6-year-old Caleb, oblivious to the dark scrutiny, chattered happily about his day, swinging his legs under the table. But across from him, his brother sat in a silence that was different from his usual withdrawn state. This was a watchful, predatory silence. When Regina gently asked if he was feeling okay, Damien offered no reply. He simply continued his staring until she, uncomfortable, was forced to look away. Later, she would again tell herself it was just another one of his impenetrable moods, but a deep-seated unease stuck with her long after the dishes were cleared and put away. The following afternoon, June 26th, a neighbor tending to his garden noticed Damien near the back fence line. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as the teenager drove a spade into the dry earth with a focused, rhythmic motion, cutting deliberate lines in the dirt. When the neighbor called out, asking what kind of project he was working on, Damien didn't even bother to look up. "Garden work," he replied flatly, and immediately resumed his digging. The neighbor later recounted that he simply laughed, shrugged, and walked away, thinking nothing of it. In the context of the investigation, however, it became the kind of innocuous answer that hides a terrifying truth. That same evening, Aunt Lydia made one of her regular stops by the house, bringing groceries to help her overburdened sister. She saw Damien sitting alone on the front porch steps, his head bowed, his hands clasped tightly together, as if he were waiting for something, or steeling himself for it. Later, inside, she overheard him murmur the same haunting phrase to his mother that he had uttered months before. "If you ever have another one," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "it'll just be me left." Again, there was no laughter. No smirk, no hint of irony. He stated it as a cold, hard fact and then walked away. Lydia froze in the hallway, the heavy grocery bag straining her arms. Regina, seeing her sister's shocked expression, quickly waved it off as nonsense, and him just being dramatic. But Lydia couldn't shake the chilling, matter-of-fact tone he had used. She thought about pulling her sister aside for a serious, urgent conversation, but the moment slipped away, buried under the mundane chatter of dinner plans and unpacking groceries. By June 27th, the house was draped in a fragile, false sense of normalcy. Caleb sat on the living room floor, racing his toy cars across the rug, his joyful laughter echoing through the small home. Regina was in the kitchen, cooking dinner and humming softly, the smell of garlic and herbs filling the air. Damien appeared in the doorway, watching his brother play. For a single, fleeting moment, it seemed a connection might be made. He stepped closer and bent down, his hand reaching out to straighten one of Caleb's cars on its track. Caleb looked up and grinned widely, believing his big brother was finally, truly joining in his game. But just as quickly as the moment arrived, it vanished. Damien's hand retracted, he straightened up, and without a word, turned and walked down the hall to his bedroom. The door closed with a soft but definitive click that seemed to cut through the homely noise of sizzling food and child's play. That tiny, aborted flicker of normalcy, the touch of a toy car, only made his subsequent retreat feel all the more ominous and sharp. June 28th, the day of the tragedy, presented a facade of utter routine. Caleb dragged a large cardboard box into the living room, intent on transforming it into a garage for his beloved cars. Regina was busy preparing dinner, asking Damien to help by setting out glasses on the table. He complied, placing them neatly at each setting, and then sat down without uttering a syllable. Caleb, excited, asked if he could keep his cars on the table nearby, and Regina, tired, gave in, telling him to just push them to the side. Damien's eyes followed the small toys as they slid across the tabletop, his face a cold, unreadable mask. Regina, trying to foster some normalcy, cut him a piece of chicken and told him to eat while it was still hot. He nodded once, ate his food quickly and mechanically, and left the table without a word. The day folded uneventfully into evening. Caleb played contentedly on the floor, Regina wiped down the kitchen counters, and Damien vanished into the solitude of his room. Lydia called around 8 p.m. to check in, her voice warm and concerned, saying she would stop by in the morning. Regina texted back a simple heart emoji, consciously pushing down the knot of anxiety that had been tightening in her chest all week. She told herself that Saturday would be better, that she would make time to talk to Damien. She went through the nightly ritual of tucking Caleb into bed, kissing his forehead, and promising him more car races tomorrow. Then, she paused in the dim hallway outside Damien's closed door. She stood there for a long moment, her hand hovering near the knob, thinking about knocking, about asking him what was wrong, about finally breaking through. But the weight of her exhaustion was too heavy. She convinced herself there would be time later, that this was just another phase, that he would come out of it. She turned and walked away. By the night of June 28, 2024, there would be no more. Later. Every choice, every ignored sign, every moment of silence had converged, and everything was about to change forever. The late hours of June 28, 2024, closed in around the Moore house with the kind of heavy, suffocating summer quiet that makes every small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of a clock, seem amplified. Inside, the ceiling fan in the living room pushed warm, stagnant air in slow, lazy circles, its monotonous hum the only soundtrack to the silence that descended after Regina stepped out. She had grabbed her keys and purse for a last-minute grocery run, told Damien to watch his brother, kissed a sleepy Caleb on the forehead, and promised to be back quickly. The definitive click of the door latch and the fading sound of her car engine pulling out of the driveway left the house in the hands of her two sons. Terence was still at the garage, hours from returning home. In the sudden quiet, Damien realized the house was finally, completely, his. In the living room, Caleb played on the rug, his toy cars lined up like a tiny, eager racing team. He provided his own sound effects and commentary, laughing at his own imaginative storylines, utterly absorbed in a world of innocent play. Damien watched him from the couch, his chest feeling tight and constricted, the pacing, violent thoughts in his head growing louder than the low murmur of the television. He stood up abruptly, walked to the window to peer out into the dark street, turned back, sat down, and then stood again. Each movement was agitated, charged with a nervous energy, as if he were circling a decision he could no longer contain. At one point, Caleb, seeking connection, held up his favorite small blue car. "Do you want to play?" he asked, his voice hopeful. For a single, suspended second, Damien froze. His hand almost twitched upward to reach for it. He almost lowered himself to sit on the carpet beside his brother. That tiny, luminous flicker of possibility, that he might choose connection over annihilation, that he might turn away from the abyss, hung in the air between them. But it was snuffed out almost instantly. His hand dropped back to his side as if weighted, and his eyes shifted away from Caleb's hopeful face, toward the kitchen. His movement became slow, deliberate, and grimly purposeful. The kitchen drawer slid open with a sharp, metallic scrape that sounded explosive in the quiet house. His hand closed around the handle of a kitchen knife, the cool steel feeling foreign and final against his palm. He stood there for a moment under the dim glow of the kitchen light, the knife heavy in his grip, seemingly whispering to himself, reinforcing the warped justification that this was the only way, the only solution. If Caleb was gone, their parents would finally be forced to see him. They would have to remember who was there first. Back in the living room, Caleb looked up, his small face puckering in confusion at the sight of his brother. And that is where we end part 1 of this story. The signs were there for years, ignored or dismissed until the moment when it was far too late. But how did Damien's rage turn into action? What exactly unfolded in that house between two brothers, one filled with light and the other consumed by shadows? In part 2, we'll walk through the chilling sequence of events that led to the final, unthinkable act, and the aftermath that left an entire community shattered. Don't miss it. Subscribe now. Hit the bell so you're the first to know when part 2 drops. Speechaloon, tell us your name and where you're watching from in the comments for a shout out in the next episode. And most importantly, share your thoughts. Could anyone have stopped Damien before it was too late? This is the killer next door. Stay aware. Part 2 is coming.